Welcome to the January 2022 edition of the OPEC Monthly Oil Market Report, or MOMAR. Today we would like to present a short overview of the key highlights of the report, as well as the main changes and revisions from last month. We also invite you to view or download the complete version of our MOMAR, which can be accessed on OPEC's official website at www.opec.org. It provides comprehensive coverage of oil market developments over the past month, as well as a detailed view of what our expert analysts forecast for the months to come. The global GDP growth forecasts for 2021 and 2022 remain unchanged at 5.5% and 4.2% respectively. The U.S. is estimated to grow by 5.5% in 2021, while growth is slightly lower for 2022 at 4%. Eurozone economic growth for 2021 is revised up to 5.2%, while growth for 2022 remains unchanged at 3.9%. Japan's economic growth forecast for 2021 is revised down to 1.8%, while growth for 2022 remains unchanged at 2.2%. Growth forecasts in emerging economies remain largely unchanged, with China's forecast at 8% for 2021 and 5.6% for 2022. India's forecast for 2021 stands at 8.8%, and 7% in 2022. Russia's GDP growth forecast remains unchanged at 4% for 2021 and 2.7% for 2022. Brazil's economic growth forecast for 2021 is unchanged at 4.7%, while growth for 2022 was revised down to 1.5%. The spread of COVID-19 variants and the effectiveness of vaccines, as well as the pace of vaccine rollouts worldwide, remain key uncertainties. Moreover, supply chain bottlenecks and sovereign debt levels in many regions, together with rising inflationary pressures and the responses of central banks, remain key factors that require close monitoring. World oil demand growth in 2021 is unchanged from last month's assessment at 5.7 million barrels per day to average 96.6 million barrels per day. An upward revision in the fourth quarter of 21 amid better-than-anticipated transportation fuel consumption in the OECD was offset by a downward revision in the third quarter of 2021 due to implementation of the latest actual data. Oil demand in the OECD is estimated to have averaged 2.51 million barrels per day, and in the non-OECD region 3.14 million barrels per day for the year. In 2022, the forecast for world oil demand growth also remains unchanged at 4.2 million barrels per day, with total global consumption at 100.8 million barrels per day. In the OECD, oil demand is forecast to grow by 1.8 million barrels per day, while in the non-OECD, demand is projected to increase by 2.3 million barrels per day. While the impact of the Omicron variant is projected to be mild and short-lived, uncertainties prevail as to additional variants and hospitalization levels impacting the workforce and potential renewed mobility restrictions amid an otherwise steady global economic recovery. Non-OPEC liquid supply growth in 2021 remains unchanged at around 0.7 million barrels per day year-on-year to average 63.6 million barrels per day. Upward revisions in the U.S. and Kazakhstan were offset by downward adjustments to Brazil, Canada, Ecuador, and Norway. In 2021, the oil supply estimate primarily sees growth in Canada, Russia, China, the U.S., Guyana, Norway, Argentina, and Qatar, while output is expected to have declined in the UK, Brazil, Colombia, and Indonesia. Similarly, the non-OPEC supply growth forecast for 2022 is unchanged at around 3 million barrels per day, to average 66.7 million barrels per day. The main drivers of liquid supply growth are expected to be the U.S. and Russia, followed by Brazil, Canada, Kazakhstan, Norway, and Guyana. OPEC crude oil production increased by 166,000 barrels per day in December month-on-month to average 27.88 million barrels per day, according to available secondary sources to date. Production increased mostly in Angola, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the UAE, while it declined in Libya and Nigeria. Preliminary November data sees total OECD commercial oil stocks down by 16 million barrels month-on-month. At 2,721 million barrels, they were 389 million barrels lower than the same month in 2020, 247 million barrels lower than the latest 5-year average, and 221 million barrels below the 2015 to 2019 average. Within the components, crude and product stocks fell month-on-month by 12.7 million barrels and 3.3 million barrels, respectively. At 1,317 million barrels, crude stocks in the OECD were 143 million barrels lower than the latest 5-year average, and 137 million barrels below the 2015 to 2019 average. OECD product stocks stood at 1,405 million barrels, representing a deficit of 104 million barrels compared with the latest 5-year average, and 84 million barrels below the 2015 to 2019 average. In terms of days of forward cover, OECD commercial stocks fell month-on-month by 0.2 days in November to stand at 60.7 days. This is 13.2 days below November 2020 levels, 3.6 days less than the latest 5-year average, and 1.5 days lower than the 2015 to 2019 average. Within the regions, OECD Americas and OECD Asia Pacific stood at 59 million barrels and 68 million barrels below the latest 5-year average, respectively. OECD Europe inventories showed a deficit of around 120 million barrels compared with the latest 5-year average. Demand for OPEC crude in 2021 stands at 27.8 million barrels per day, around 4.9 million barrels per day higher than in 2020. According to secondary sources, OPEC crude production averaged 25.2 million barrels per day in the first quarter of 21, 1.1 million barrels per day lower than demand for OPEC crude in the same period. In the second quarter of 21, OPEC crude production averaged 25.5 million barrels per day, which was 1.5 million barrels per day lower than demand for OPEC crude. In the third quarter of 21, OPEC crude oil production averaged 28.6 million barrels per day, 1.7 million barrels per day lower than demand for OPEC crude. Demand for OPEC crude in 2022 stands at 28.9 million barrels per day, around 1 million barrels per day higher than in 2021. Thank you for joining us for this overview of the key highlights and changes as featured in the January 2022 issue of the OPEC Monthly Oil Market Report. For more detailed information on this and other reports, please visit our website at www.opec.org. We appreciate your interest and look forward to you joining us again for the next edition of the MOMAR, which will be published on the 10th of February 2022. Until then, goodbye.